want to really dig into Insidious, huh? Go beyond just jumping at the scares and really figure out why this movie works so well as horror.
You've come to the right place, and yet your analysis was really thorough. There's definitely a lot to unpack here.
You mentioned right off the bat that Insidious does something different compared to, like, your typical haunted house movie.
I gotta say, I agree. What is it about this film that gets under your skin? It's not just me, right?
No, you're definitely not alone. A lot of it comes down to the further that parallel dimension they introduce. It's full of these lost souls, malevolent entities, just this whole other layer of, well, cosmic dread.
Oh, absolutely. It's like haunted house, sure, we've seen that. But what if it's not just the house, but something bigger? Like the whole idea of reality itself being messed up. Exactly. The further isn't just a setting. It becomes this manifestation of all those anxieties we have about what comes after, you know, the unknown, and the fact that something dark could just cross over into our world.
Okay, so let's break down the further a bit more. Your analysis touched on astral projection, how the characters can actually interact with this other dimension. For those listening who haven't seen the film, or maybe need a refresher, can you explain how that all works?
Sure. So astral projection, at least how Insidious uses it, is this ability to separate your consciousness from your physical body.
Like an out-of-body experience.
Exactly. And it becomes this dangerous link to the further. It lets certain characters travel there, interact with it, but it also leaves them incredibly vulnerable.
Which is terrifying when you think about Dalton, the little boy at the heart of all this. I mean, a scary encounter in your house is one thing, but the thought that your kid could just wander into another dimension in their sleep, that's every parent's nightmare.
It plays on that primal fear of losing someone to something we don't understand. Absolutely.
To a place where you can't follow.
And the film does a clever job of putting that against the backdrop of the Lambert family's everyday struggles. Moving into a new home, financial stress, you know, just trying to adjust. They could be any family, which makes the supernatural stuff all the more unsettling.
Right. It's like their world is unraveling, but they don't even get why at first.
Yeah.
Your analysis really honed in on how Insidious uses those really common fears we all have.
Yeah.
Losing a child, that feeling when communication breaks down, a creeping sense of something's wrong, but I don't know what.
It's so effective because we can all relate to that, right? And what makes it even worse is how the film portrays the breakdown of communication between Josh and Renai, the parents.
Because they're not on the same page at all.
Exactly. Josh dismisses the weird stuff at first, while Renai is the one living the nightmare. You see how fear, stress, it can all fracture even the strongest bonds, especially when you're dealing with something like a haunting.
And it's not just any haunting either. The red-faced demon, the entity that's after Dalton. That's a scary idea on a whole other level. What makes that particular entity such an effective villain?
Well, for one, he's just downright disturbing to look at. It's not a ghost with unfinished business. Not really. He's something purely malevolent. The design, the way he moves, there's this rawness, this aggression to him that's different.
And the mystery surrounding him. The film never fully explains what he is or where he comes from.
Which honestly makes him even scarier. The unknown is always more frightening than something you can understand and rationalize.
And you can tell he's fixated on Dalton. Like, whatever this thing is, it feeds off that innocence, that vulnerability, you know? And the film doesn't just rely on jump scares, does it? There's a whole psychological layer that gets under your skin.
It's insidious, just like the title says. It gets into their lives, their relationships, even their home, a place that should feel safe, becomes threatening. And you're right, it's not just about the jump scares, although you did mention some effective ones. What stood out to you about them?
It's how they're used. James Wan, the director, he knows how to build tension. He'll have these quiet moments, these long stretches of suspense, and just when you think, okay, it's safe, bam.
He plays with our expectations, doesn't he? Knows exactly how to lull us into a false sense of security. Like he understands that what we don't see is often far scarier.
Exactly. Like that scene where the demon just appears behind Josh in broad daylight. He's on the phone, totally casual.
Yeah.
It's not even hiding in the shadows or anything.
It's that reminder that nowhere is truly safe. And it's not just what we see, it's what we hear, too. You mentioned the sound design, those creepy children's lullabies, all distorted and echoing through the further.
Ugh, seriously. Nightmares. What is it about those sounds? Like they're supposed to be innocent, but they're just wrong.
Because it's taking something familiar, something comforting, and twisting it. Those lullabies are supposed to soothe you, but here they mean danger. And it's not just the music, the house creaking, those whispers. It lingers in your mind even after the scene's over.
The sound is like its own character, always reminding you something's watching. Speaking of unsettling, your analysis mentioned something I couldn't get over. Joseph Bishara, the composer. He plays the red-faced demon.
It's brilliant. Adds this whole other level to the experience, don't you think? The guy who created the music, the sounds that scare you, he is the monster.
Blurs that line between real and supernatural even further. And the cinematography, too. John R. Leonetti's work is incredible. You mentioned the long takes, those slow, deliberate camera movements. What do those add to the atmosphere?
They create such a sense of unease. It's like the camera itself is stalking the characters. You're never quite sure what you're going to see next.
And the way he frames certain shots, leaving all that empty space, like in the foreground or off to the side, just makes you feel like something could jump out at any second.
He uses darkness so effectively, concealing as much as he reveals. Honestly, it's a masterclass in building suspense through visuals alone.
And that sense of dread is cranked up in the further. Everything changes.
Yeah.
The color palette, the lighting, it's like this oppressive darkness with just these flashes of light here and there. Did you notice how that contrast between the real world and the further makes it even scarier?
Oh, absolutely. The moment they cross over, you're right there with them in this otherworldly realm. Disorienting, claustrophobic, you lose all sense of normalcy, and the characters, they seem so much smaller, more vulnerable.
Like they're totally out of their element, all the rules have changed. And you can't forget the practical effects. So much more effective than CGI in a film like this.
They make everything feel more tangible, more real, that visceral quality. CGI just can't replicate it.
You mentioned the old woman who haunts Josh, the rotting bridal gown, everything. Pure nightmare feel.
Ugh, gives me chills just thinking about it. She's like this embodiment of trauma, don't you think?
Absolutely. Unresolved issues, the past coming back to haunt the present, and the fact that she's connected to Josh's family history adds another layer to it all.
It's giving generational trauma, for sure. Like, some things just keep repeating, getting passed down. These family secrets, they always find a way to resurface, don't they? Makes you think about your own family, those skeletons in the closet.
It really gets under your skin that way. And you can't talk about Insidious without mentioning that ending.
Oh, man, that ending.
Just when you think the Lamberts are safe, they've escaped the further.
Yeah.
But then, that twist. Josh, you think he's okay, and then bam, he's the one possessed.
The thing they were trying to get away from, it never left him. And what's worse, it makes you realize that for some families, the nightmare never really ends. They endure. For our listener, just to refresh, the family, they go through this whole ordeal, they think they've won, but then it turns out the dad, Josh, he's become the vessel for that red-faced demon.
Brutal. It undercuts the whole happy ending thing you expect, leaves you with this awful feeling in your gut. Did the filmmakers talk about why they went with an ending like that?
I think part of it is just subverting expectations. We're so used to good triumphing over evil in these kinds of films, you know. But Insidious, it shows us that sometimes you don't get that clean victory. It makes it that much more realistic. It adds to the tragedy of it all. This family, they fought so hard that bring them down.
It's like a classic horror story, you know. Be careful what you wish for. Or maybe be careful digging up the past. And of course, it sets up the sequels perfectly. But even on its own, that first Insidious movie, it felt different. Like it came at a time when a lot of horror was all about gore and torture.
And then Insidious came along and it was all about atmosphere, suspense, psychological horror, like you said, a much smarter brand of horror. I think a lot of people were craving something like this.
You mentioned earlier the boom in those paranormal investigation shows too. I think there's a connection.
Definitely. Insidious reignited this fascination with the unknown. It made the paranormal scary again, but also kind of exciting. That idea that there's more out there than we can see, than we can explain. It's terrifying and thrilling all at once.
You're right. It made it okay to be afraid of the dark again. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Insidious, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
Insidious is more than just a scary movie. It's a story about family, about the things that haunt us. The filmmakers used every trip in the book to get under our skin. Sound, visuals, pacing. But at its core, it's a story that stays with you because it forces us to confront our own darkness, you know.
So well said. And if the further is a reflection of our deepest fears, I think it's safe to say we've all got some pretty messed up stuff lurking inside us. Well, that's all the time we have for today. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the twisted world of Insidious. And we'll see you next time, and we'll take another deep